Today I'll be going over Chapter 10 of Alanna Nash's book, The Colonel. Chapter 10 is titled The Man in the Shadows. Nash says it is unclear exactly when or how Tom Parker first learned about Elvis Presley. Several people later claim they were the ones who alerted Parker to Elvis, who had begun attracting attention late in 1954 through his regular appearances on the widely broadcast Louisiana Hayride radio program. Parker likely became interested in Elvis after hearing how much attention Elvis was getting on the Hayride and on tours through Texas. Parker was looking for another artist with Eddie Arnold level potential, and people in the country music world, including Texarkana DJ Uncle Dudley and Gabe Tucker, began telling him about Presley. It wasn't until his friend Oscar Davis reported to him about Elvis that turned his head, though. In October 1954, Davis was in Memphis doing advance work for Parker and Eddie Arnold. At WMPS radio, DJ Bob Neal played Elvis's Blue Moon of Kentucky and told Davis that the teenage singer was drawing packed crowds and screaming women at the Eagle's Nest. That evening, Davis and Neal went to the club because Davis wanted to meet Elvis. Bob Neal introduced Elvis to Davis, and a few days later, Elvis came backstage at Ellis Auditorium to continue the conversation and meet Eddie Arnold and the Jordanaires. During that meeting, Davis made an early tentative arrangement to take over Elvis's management from Scotty Moore, who had been handling him at that point. Davis returned to Nashville the following Monday and went straight to Parker's home to report what he had found in Memphis. He found Parker outside his office casually having lunch with Charlie Lamb, another former carnival man who had moved into the country music business as a journalist and advertising agent. Lamb says, "It was really Oscar who found Elvis. He came over and said, 'I saw the darndest act you ever imagined. This kid who does this twisting around and so forth.' The Colonel's eyes popped open and he said, 'Where is he? Who is he?' And he got up from the table and pulled his car out and left. He still wasn't back when I went out the next day." Nash writes, quote, "Was Parker checking out Oscar's discovery? If so, Parker kept it to himself when he returned to Nashville. But suddenly, as Elvis's drummer DJ Fontana remembers, we would see him walking around, hanging back in the shadows, but he never would say nothing. A lot of people just didn't want to deal with him." Bob Neal officially took over Elvis's management on January 1st, 1955, and wanted to work with Parker. Neal saw Parker as flashy and full of show business razzle-dazzle, but also honest, sharp, and shrewd. Most importantly, Neal hoped Parker could get Elvis placed on touring packages that would expose him to audiences outside his local region. Parker and Tom Diskin went to Shreveport on January 15, 1955 to see Elvis perform on the Louisiana Hayride. After watching Elvis's flashy performance and distinctive style, they met with Bob Neal and arranged for Parker, through Hank Snow Attractions, to handle Elvis's bookings. Parker was already thinking bigger, even suggesting Elvis could end up playing a major resort hotel in Nevada. Nash's Parker was already planning to eventually take full control of Elvis's career, but he had to wait because Bob Neal still had a management contract. Neal would later say, "I always felt that Elvis was going to be a big artist, but I never would have believed how big, so I just preferred to drop out of the scene." Until Neal's agreement expired, Parker kept his true intentions quiet and acted carefully, even hiding his plans from Oscar Davis. Parker and Davis had a close, complicated bond rooted in their carnival backgrounds and shared interest in illegal gambling. He respected Davis enough to lend him money, but both men had a ruthless quality. They could rationalize almost anything they did, including using people and then moving on without guilt. Years earlier, Davis had abandoned his wife and 5-year-old son and never saw or acknowledged them again. Oscar Davis Jr. remembers, "He was a deserter, plain and simple." Parker had no hesitation about advising Oscar Davis, even though Davis's last major client, Hank Williams, had died amid alcohol, drugs, and the pressures of fame. Just 2 years later, Davis was openly hoping to take over Elvis Presley's management, and Parker was aware of that ambition while maneuvering around him. Parker said, "The guy will get nowhere on Sound Records," among a host of other objections. He told Davis that he had become too excited over this Presley kid, and eventually Davis later admitted, "I became completely discouraged about the whole thing." Nash writes, quote, Parker was a skilled tactician who approached any negotiation with the forethought of a master chess player, knowing all the possible strategies and the likelihood of how the moves would play out. Brushing aside Davis more easily than he could dispense with Hank Snow or even the easygoing Neal, Parker turned his attention to Sam Phillips, who operated the Sun Records label. Without foundation, Parker started the rumor that Presley's contract was for sale. Phillips, stunned to learn of the gossip, struck back with the breathtaking demand of $35,000. End quote. Phillips remembers, I thought, hey, I'll make him an offer that I know they will refuse, and then I'll tell them they'd better not spread this poison anymore. I absolutely did not think Tom Parker could raise the $35,000, and that would have been fine. But he raised the money, and damn, I couldn't back out then. Parker sent a $5,000 deposit, and RCA would later pay the asking price along with a $5,000 bonus for Elvis. The money would be recovered later from royalties, but the label was still uneasy about taking such a large financial risk. RCA's CFO at the time, Norman Rakusin, remembers, "We must have met for a half hour before I put my approval on it. It was a lot of money, but Steve Scholes was so aggressive about this, he would have gone over my head if I turned him down anyhow." Later, when Carl Perkins suddenly broke through with blue suede shoes, Scholl asked Sam Phillips, "Did I buy the wrong boy?" Phillips reassured him he had not. Although RCA had already refunded Parker's deposit by then, Parker continued to claim that it was his money and personal risk that secured Elvis's contract. Nash says Parker did not fully grasp Elvis's extraordinary potential until Elvis performed in Jacksonville, Florida in May 1955. Seeing the reaction of 14,000 fans made Parker realize Elvis was not just another promising young act, he was something much bigger. At the end of the show, Elvis joked, "Girls, I'll see y'all backstage." And, well, half the crowd took it seriously and surged past the police barricade, chasing him into the locker room and trying to grab at him and tear pieces of his clothing. Marty Robbins, who was part of the show as a favorite of Parker, remembers, "He was on top of the showers trying to get away from people, guys and girls trying to grab a shoe or just anything." Nash writes, quote, "As a carnival man who only understood things in dollars and cents, Parker knew what brought him into the big tent. In a real sense, Elvis was just a male version of Marie and all the other thinly veiled dancing girls who tantalizingly promised the big striptease but never quite paid off. But now Parker realized that Elvis's popularity could go beyond even that, to the kind of rights that Frank Sinatra had inspired in his heyday. And from then on, when he went to Elvis's shows, it was the crowd Parker watched, not Elvis. That emotion could make him a very rich man almost overnight." End quote. Once Parker fully understood Elvis's commercial power, he built a massive marketing machine around him with RCA Victor and the William Morris Agency. Within about a year, Elvis became the top-selling artist in music and the highest-paid performer on television. Parker accepted an advance of nearly $40,000 from Hank Saperstein to turn Elvis into a full brand, licensing dozens of products from charm bracelets and scarves to dolls, plastic guitars, lipstick, and novelty items, generating enormous merchandise revenue. Look magazine in 1956 said, "Perhaps it is to lighten our burdens that the Lord sends us from time to time gay and imaginative men like Colonel Parker, who realize that life is a great big hilarious fruitcake loaded with potential profits." Parker's real historical importance may be that he brought old carnival methods into rock and roll and modern entertainment. He treated Elvis almost like a carnival attraction: build excitement, control the crowd, sell the spectacle, and merchandise everything possible. By using tactics of a carnival barker on his own artist, Parker helped create a model that later became standard in the music business: aggressive management, constant promotion, and turning a performer into a marketable brand. Nash says Parker may have understood how to sell Elvis, but he did not really understand Elvis as an artist. Parker personally preferred lighter, safer entertainment like Lawrence Welk and failed to appreciate Elvis's unique blend of country, pop, and rhythm and blues. Parker missed the artistry in Elvis's sound, the vocal quirks, emotional intensity, and electric style that made him revolutionary. According to RCA's Joan Jury, Parker was basically tone deaf, and he often made dismissive remarks about Elvis's music. Byron Raphael remembers, "The first time he heard, 'I want you, I need you, I love you,' he laughed and said, 'Can you imagine the kids are going to buy this stuff?'" Nash writes, quote, "Certainly neither Parker nor anyone else had the vision to see what a seismic force Elvis would become as perhaps the most influential cultural figure of the 20th century. But a decade earlier, Parker watched Dick Contino wrangle and hump his accordion as the teenagers went crazy. Now he began to fathom that Elvis could combine the threatening sexuality of Marlon Brando and the confused, sensual tension of James Dean, and in the process give voice to a powerful rising youth movement, one ravenous and itchy for change and prominence. Its purchasing power, some $7 billion in 1956 alone, would triple the sales of the American recording industry and make Elvis Presley the first RCA artist to gross more than $1 million from a single album, end quote. When Parker first met Elvis, his attention was actually onto other performers. That shows Parker was not especially gifted at recognizing artistic talent or understanding mainstream musical taste. Parker was still drawn to old-fashioned cowboy imagery, so he approached Eddie Dean, a B-list Western star. He tried to convince Dean that he could be the golden cowboy, and he suggested Dean could become a bigger star by wearing flashy gold suits, an idea that foreshadowed the kind of showy image-making Parker would later use with Elvis. But Parker had been fixating on managing Tommy Sands since 1952 after seeing him perform as a young teenager in Houston. Parker quickly began putting Sands on shows as an opening act for Eddie Arnold, which irritated Arnold because he felt Parker was becoming too personally and professionally invested in the boy. Sands saw Parker as a father figure, partly because his own father was mostly absent after the divorce. Parker seemed to be grooming him for show business, especially acting, and even staged odd tests for him. One day, he made the teenage Sands throw dirt on himself and walk several miles to a diner where Parker waited and posed as an unassuming customer. Sands would pass his acting test if he stood at the window and looked hungry enough that the management brought him in and gave him a free meal. Parker would say, "My boy, this is all just part of your education." Sands remembers, "Actually, he wanted me to be Roy Rogers, the next big cowboy movie star. That's what he saw for me." Parker tried to package Sands as a clean-cut Western-style entertainer, dressing him in cowboy hats, string ties, and other cowboy clothing. But Sands didn't want to be turned into a Roy Rogers type because he feared that image would force him to seem overly wholesome and limit his personal life, even though he deeply admired Parker. Thus, Parker shifted from trying to shape Sands as a Western-style act to trying to get him a record deal. Sands sent a demo to Steve Sholes, but Sholes quickly rejected it. Later, when Parker hit a delay in getting Elvis away from Sun Records, he had Tom Diskin contact Sholes about Sands. Diskin wrote in a letter to Sholes, "Since Elvis Presley is pretty securely tied up, it might be possible to come out with something in that vein by Tommy." Sholes politely rejected the idea that Tommy Sands could replace Elvis. Still likely to keep Parker satisfied, Sholes left the door slightly open by suggesting RCA might record Sands in a rhythm and blues influenced country style. Nash says Parker had already tried to launch Tommy Sands years earlier by taking him to New York and Nashville to record several songs, but Sands later said his voice had not matured yet and the recording failed to sell. His producer Chet Atkins had a different opinion. He said, "He was just one of those pretty faces." Nash says Parker took Sands' failure personally because he hated losing. Gabe Tucker remembers, "The fact that he didn't make a winner out of Tommy was a burr under his saddle. God, he couldn't stand to be a loser." Even though Sands had not become a major star, Parker refused to give up on him. He kept bringing Sands along during the summers, driving him from show to show and preparing him for whatever opportunity Parker hoped would come next. Parker finally felt vindicated in 1957 when Sands got the lead in NBC's The Singing Idol, a TV drama loosely based on Elvis's rise. Kraft Television Theater, who produced the show, had wanted Elvis, but Parker refused and pushed Sands instead, even calling Sands' manager Cliffy Stone. Parker even paid for the airfare for Sands' audition trip. The Singing Idol became a huge success and finally launched Sands in the way Parker had hoped. Critics praised Sands' acting and singing. Elvis himself was impressed, and Sands quickly benefited commercially. After signing with Capitol Records, his single Teenage Crush reached number 3 on the pop charts and sold 800,000 copies. Stone remembers, "That really made him. In 6 months, he'd become a fantastic star. The Ed Sullivan Show, This Is Your Life, and all the rest." Gabe Tucker said Parker could finally let go of that earlier failure and even bragged that he was being consulted about who would play him in the 1958 movie version, Sing Boy Sing. Nash writes, quote, "Parker's initial failure to launch Sands, coupled with his eagerness to shine again in the eyes of the William Morris Agency, was no small part of his drive to make Elvis America's #1 attraction. But while the Morris office denies it today, in 1955, no one at the agency in either New York or California put much faith in Presley's ability to last beyond a quick, if bizarre, blaze of fame." End quote. Parker was already pushing Harry Kalheim via letters to take Elvis seriously months before Parker officially signed him. Kalheim responded politely but did not seem especially excited, even admitting he had misplaced Elvis's photo. Parker kept pressing him anyway, insisting Elvis could become successful if he was, quote, exploited properly. Parker was already focused on Hollywood as Elvis's ultimate destination. He understood Elvis first had to become a national star, but he was so eager to get him into movies that he began planting the idea with his William Morris contact early on. Kalheim, who was based in New York and more involved with television than films, finally relented and told Parker that maybe Elvis could make a Hollywood short. On November 14, 1955, one day before RCA paid Sam Phillips $35,000 for Elvis's Sun contract, Parker told Kalheim he wanted to make a picture with Elvis and believed Elvis needed to be presented carefully in a way that matched his James Dean-like personality. Because Dean had recently died 2 months earlier, Parker wondered whether Warner Brothers might have an unused film property that could be reshaped for Elvis. Parker said, "Believe me, if you ever follow one of my hunches, follow up on this one and you won't go wrong." Just 8 days after RCA bought Elvis's contract, Kalheim was already pitching him to television contracts. He wrote to NBC's Sam Fuller saying they just tied up a youngster, Elvis Presley, a sensational singer very much on the order of Johnny Ray. Kalheim began trying to get Elvis a television appearance on NBC and told Parker he had started the process, but privately Kalheim did not seem very confident that Elvis would become important. In 1955, Byron Raphael, then a new employee at William Morris, saw a memo from Kalheim to all of the members of the West Coast office. Raphael says, essentially it said, "We've signed a new act, Elvis Presley, who's managed by Colonel Parker, who had Eddie Arnold." And it went on to say, "We've surveyed all our agents on the East Coast, and our opinion is that Presley's not going to make it. At most, he'll simply be a passing phenomenon. So get him as much work as you can, and as fast as you can." Wow, how wrong was Kalheim? Nash says Parker never saw the memo and sensed that William Morris, especially Kalheim, did not fully understand Elvis or share Parker's enthusiasm. Kalheim wanted Elvis to build exposure through New York and New Jersey dates, but Parker believed those plans were not right for Elvis and ignored the suggestion. Nash writes, quote, "What's more, in a move that angered Kalheim, Parker, who had no written contract with the Morris agency, entered into a deal with an independent agent, Steve Yates. Beginning in January 1956, Yates booked Elvis for 4 consecutive weeks on CBS TV's Stage Show, the popular Saturday night vaudeville program hosted by jazz greats Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey. There, Elvis would debut his first RCA single, Heartbreak Hotel, with a bump-and-grind musical backing that was not much different from what Presley's drummer, DJ Fontana, played in strip joints." End quote. Kalheim was upset when he found out Elvis had been booked on Stage Show for what became 6 appearances. Parker replied with a slippery, evasive letter, avoiding a direct explanation of how he used Yates while criticizing Kalheim for being too passive, just sending letters and waiting instead of aggressively making things happen. Parker fumed, "I don't think this artist was pitched full force," and he often would go into run-on sentences and the peculiar sentence structure of a man who learned English later in life. He wrote, "You know as well as I do, offering a new artist is one thing, but selling one is another. If I waited for someone to call me with deals all the time, I would have to start selling candy apples again." The conflict with Kalheim led William Morris to formalize its role with Elvis. On January 31st, 1956, the agency prepared a memo giving itself exclusive rights to represent Elvis across major entertainment unions and guilds, including musicians, TV radio performers, variety artists, and film actors, as well as for general services and package deals. The memo was addressed to Parker, and it gave him, quote, "final approval of all contracts to be entered into for Elvis Presley during the term of the respective exclusive agency agreements," end quote. There were 2 signatures at the bottom, Nat Lefkowitz from the Morris Agency's contract department and Elvis Presley. Nash writes, quote, "In agreeing to such an arrangement, 6 weeks before he signed a final contract with Parker, Elvis effectively granted the Colonel total control over almost every facet of his career," end quote. Parker understood that television could make Elvis a national sensation, but he also privately feared Elvis's popularity might not last, according to Bobby Ross. So he used a carnival-style strategy. Give the public just enough Elvis to create excitement and demand, book him on the biggest TV shows, Milton Berle, Steve Allen, Ed Sullivan, and then maybe never let him appear on television again. He wanted Elvis highly visible but not overexposed, especially to the press. Thus, Parker deliberately limited Elvis's interviews to keep him mysterious and fantasy-like. By controlling how much the public heard from Elvis directly, Parker allowed fans to project whatever image they wanted onto him: innocent mama's boy, religious young man, or dangerous sex symbol. This also hid Elvis's immaturity and made his public image seem more powerful than his actual offstage personality. Parker advised Elvis early early on to drop the corny comedy bits that were common in old hillbilly stage shows. Elvis apparently listened after making a crude marriage joke at an Alabama high school concert. Why buy a cow when you can steal milk through the fence? Elvis may have stopped doing the old comedy routines on stage, but his humor was still often crude and childish. He might belt on stage, and in private he joked around with his cousins and close friends in a very juvenile, good old boy way, even though he later developed more wit and sophistication. Nash writes, quote, "The portrait of Presley as he really was at 21, acne-scarred, sweet-natured, and simple except in his music and his peculiar relationships with women, already 3 at a time during his Louisiana hayride days, and his parents, whom he affectionately addressed as his babies, was either too dull or too scandalous for Parker to let out." End quote. Nash says Parker was still tightly controlling press access to Elvis in 1957. When Time reporter Bob Schulman tried to go backstage at Elvis's Seattle show, Parker blocked him like a guard. Parker told him, "If you want to hear anything about Elvis, you've got to talk to me." Schulman remembers, "There was absolutely no access to Elvis himself, although we could see him through the open door in this garish yellow incandescent light. He was leaning back in a camp chair, scratching his scrotum." Parker's tight control over Elvis's interviews allowed reporters to project their own opinions onto him. Since they rarely got real access to Elvis, some portrayed him as dangerous and immoral, especially after his provocative hound dog performance on the Milton Berle show, while others saw him as a symbol of youthful freedom. Even San Diego's ban on his dancing was treated by the press like a major national crisis. Nash writes, quote, "Parker, who tied on a vendor's apron to peddle both 'I love Elvis' and 'I hate Elvis' buttons to folks who reacted strongly one way or another, didn't care what the newsman said as long as they said it, and paid their own admission to the shows. Not even an 'Elvis is queer' story got his feathers up. When Gabe Tucker threw just such a magazine piece on his desk, Parker didn't say a word until his friend stopped sputtering. 'Well,' Parker finally said, 'did they spell his name right?' End quote. To the press, Elvis became less a fully known person and more a manufactured figure, and Parker treated Elvis as an extension of himself, a vehicle for Parker's ambition, his ego, and his desire for power. Nash says Parker also controlled his own media image by limiting how much he gave reporters. When he did speak, he kept answers brief and guarded. "If it's a question, I'll say yes or no. That's all the taping I do." In doing so, he made himself seem mysterious and important, almost like a celebrity in his own right. His colonel title and public persona fed his ego and helped him see himself as larger than life. Often when he was presented with something that displeased him, he would say, "I don't think the colonel is going to like this," as if he were some mystical entity. Of course, Parker had another practical reason for limiting Elvis's television appearances: money. If they can see Elvis for nothing, they won't pay to see him. He wanted to build Elvis into a financial empire, not let him become too common or overexposed. Elvis's major TV appearances helped Heartbreak Hotel sell over 1 million copies, and his first Ed Sullivan Show appearance drew an enormous audience. Parker could then brag that since taking over, Elvis's fee had jumped from $300 to $25,000 per night, even more than Martin and Lewis, the top show business act at the time. "Colonel," the grateful but bewildered Elvis supposedly said, "you put a lump in my throat." To which Parker allegedly replied, "And you put a lump in my wallet." Nash says that right before Elvis's first Ed Sullivan Show appearance, Parker was already renegotiating Elvis's RCA deal. RCA's Norman Racusin, and a company attorney, met Parker in his suite at the Warwick Hotel and agreed to erase the $40,000 advance against Elvis's royalties. Then there was a knock on the door, and it was Elvis and his cousins saying they wanted to go to Radio City Music Hall. Parker worried they might cause trouble or attract attention, but Elvis promised they would only watch the show in return, so Parker reluctantly allowed it. Racusin remembers, "Elvis was still standing there, and Parker said, 'Now what?' Elvis said, 'I need some money.' Parker reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of cash and handed Elvis 2 $100 bills. 'Now remember, don't do anything to draw attention to yourself.' Elvis told him, 'We won't.'" Elvis's rise had happened incredibly fast. Less than a year before, Parker had casually allowed Texas teenager Kay Wheeler to start the first national Elvis Presley fan club. Carol Asmus wrote in a letter to Kay, "Elvis is just one of our many attractions, and at the present time there are no fan club facilities for him, and we have no immediate plans for any." Soon after, Tom Diskin began supporting Kay Wheeler's fan club by sending her photos to distribute. Wheeler was also part of the teen dance scene, and Elvis even asked her to teach him her rock and bop top dance steps during a San Antonio performance. Kay's fan club quickly grew to tens of thousands, and that's when Parker moved in and took control of the idea. He created the official Elvis Presley fan club and turned it into another revenue stream, charging fans for photos, membership cards, and newsletters, things Wheeler had been helping distribute without charge to fans. Elvis's TV exposure caused fan club money to explode almost overnight, and the Madison, Tennessee post office was suddenly flooded with payments and requests. The fan club operation became so large that Parker needed extra help just to handle the mail. Bill Denny, son of Grand Ole Opry manager Jim Denny, who had turned down Elvis in 1954, worked for Parker that summer and would drive to the Madison post office multiple times a day to pick up huge sacks of fan mail, sometimes with Bevo Beavis helping him. By then, Parker had hired Tom Diskin's sisters, Mary and Patty, who were quiet, loyal, and devoutly Catholic. Parker had earlier booked them as the Diskin sisters during the Eddie Arnold years when Tom was managing them. Mary and Patty Diskin worked out of a converted shed behind Parker's house, processing huge amounts of fan mail with Jimmy Rose, who Parker had temporarily made fan club president. The money was coming in so fast that they handled it assembly line style and dropped the cash into a large metal tub on the floor. Denny recalls, "No one really counted it because it didn't matter. If you were a kid someplace and you wanted a picture of Elvis, you got it." The fan club business grew too big to run out of Parker's backyard office. Within months, Parker paid Charlie Lamb $10,000 to take it over and move the operation into a rented cafeteria in Nashville's Masonic Lodge building, where 21 women assembled Elvis fan packages with a photo, membership card, and button. Lamb remembers, "This thing became a beautiful, successful nightmare." Fan club money was coming in so quickly that Lamb could not keep up with the deposits and even needed an armored car to come collect the cash. After Elvis's first Ed Sullivan Show appearance in September 1956, Parker handed the fulfillment side over to merchandiser Hank Saperstein's company, Special Projects. Nash writes, quote, "However, Parker's idea was not to make money off the fans so much as it was to make it off deals, since he was never really concerned with selling Elvis to the public, but to the people who sold the public, first to the executives who controlled the television and radio networks, then the press, and soon the motion picture moguls. Above all, he enjoyed the fine art of negotiation, of winning, and of getting the best of the other man, even if it was a friend like Lee Gordon, who, along with Oscar Davis, promoted many of Elvis's early shows," end quote. Parker made sure no promoter profited more from Elvis than he did. Instead of accepting a flat fee while promoters made huge money at the door, Parker adjusted Elvis's price based on demand and only booked venues he knew would sell out, something Sam Phillips said was a real stroke of genius. This protected him from being cheated on ticket counts, but it also squeezed promoters so they could not make much profit themselves. Sorry guys, you can probably hear, I live in like a flight path, so sometimes you'll hear like airplanes going by. Parker allegedly joked, "You don't have to be nice to people on the way up if you're not coming back down." Nash writes, quote, "From the beginning of the relationship, Parker, whose agreement with Elvis was for a 25% commission on all monies, royalties, or profits, also charged Elvis for any expenses as he had Eddie Arnold. It was part of the game with the Colonel that he would pay nothing out of his own pocket, no matter how small or trivial. If he had lunch with someone and his companion wouldn't pick up the cost of his meal, Parker later wrote it off against Presley's 75%, figuring Elvis was his only client, and that in one way or another, the conversation would have benefited his career," end quote. Elvis largely trusted Parker and didn't involve himself in the business details such as the fine print. Parker had bragged to associates, "As long as Elvis can write a check for something he wants, he doesn't care how much money is in the bank." And Parker wasn't lying. In fact, Elvis trusted Parker so completely that he stopped paying close attention to the business side, not even bothering to look at the checks Parker's people brought him. Soon after the RCA deal closed, Elvis even sent Parker a telegram pledging his loyalty, a statement that would later come back to haunt him. The note read, quote, "Dear Colonel, words can never tell you how my folks and I appreciate what you did for me. I've always known, and now my folks are assured that you are the best, most wonderful person I could ever hope to work with. Believe me when I say I will stick with you through thick and thin and do everything I can to uphold your faith in me. Again, I say thanks, and I love you like a father, Elvis Presley," end quote. Oh, Elvis, if you only knew. Nash says Elvis did not realize Parker was likely making extra money on the side through separate deals and gimmicky promotions. Even though Parker kept careful official records, some of this outside money may never have been properly documented or shared with Elvis. Byron Raphael remembers, "Promoters would come in to try to get an Elvis Presley concert, and they'd ask what it would cost. The Colonel wouldn't tell them. He'd say, 'Here's what I want you to do. I want you to bring in $50,000 in cash, and I want you to put it on the bed. And if it's enough money, we'll do a personal appearance for you. And if it isn't enough money, you don't get the personal appearance, but I keep 10% just for my time. And people would do it. Nash writes, quote, such chutzpah demonstrates Parker's two major rules of business. First, that everything costs. There's no free lunch. And second, always know where the money is before you make the deal. End quote. Parker liked staying personally involved in the hustle of the business. Even though he had staff, he often answered calls himself from the basement office of his Madison home, surrounded by multiple phones and lines. Bill Denny described him as being completely in his element there. Denny remembers, when someone would ask for Colonel Parker, he would say, well, he's on the phone right now. He'd find out who it was, and if it was someone he was in a deal with, he'd put them on hold. Then he'd come back a little later and say that the colonel was still talking, and he'd really hammer them around. Many times I heard him trying to put a deal together, and he'd say, well, if you don't take it now, the next call is going to cost you $10,000 more. Parker demanded most, if not all, of Elvis's appearance fee before a show ever happened. Promoters usually had to pay 50 to 60% up front, and often the remaining balance when returning the signed contract. If they were allowed to pay on show day, Parker expected cash before Elvis performed, not a check. Nash says Parker's hardball tactics came partly from his carnival past, where he had learned not to trust promoters. He would rather be seen as difficult than as being stupid. In his mind, most of the people he had known in show business ended up broke. Parker was obsessed with making and protecting money, but not because he wanted to live extravagantly. He and Marie lived very modestly, even below what they could afford. He didn't spend lavishly in a refined way, but he did dress like a showman when promoting Elvis. His clothes were loud, flashy, and deliberately attention-grabbing. Pink satin shirt, white shoes, suspenders, big hat. But aside from a few custom pieces from Nudi's rodeo tailors, he often dressed shabby on purpose. It was part of his act. By looking poor, plain, or harmless, he could make people underestimate him and gain an advantage in negotiations. Nash writes, quote, however, as Parker became more prosperous, he began to lavish luxuries on Marie. In Florida, the old-timers insist that Marie was always a rung above her husband on the social ladder, even with her impoverished origins and wild behavior. While others find it hard to believe, let's say she wasn't too much with the social graces. They were two of a kind, and nothing was ever going to change them, ventures RCA publicity director Ann Fulcino. Marie's union with Parker would, in time, allow her to reinvent herself despite her husband's own rough manners, end quote. Marie used her marriage to Parker as a way to distance herself from poverty and reinvent herself socially, much like Parker had reinvented himself. As Parker became successful, she embraced the symbols of status, jewelry, expensive clothes, and many shoes, especially because she remembered the hardship of the Depression when she had to cover holes in her soles with cardboard. Her daughter-in-law, Sandra Polk Ross, remembers, she had a 12-foot closet just for coats. The irony is that she usually didn't show them off in public. Aside from traveling with a large jewelry chest, she mostly kept her finer things put away and dressed more modestly. Some said she was happiest when she was playing poker with her best friend, Mother Mabel Carter. Nash says Parker indulged Marie because she gave him emotional stability and grounding, but he also had a hoarding-like attachment to old, useless things and seemed unable to throw them away. That mindset affected Marie too, even with spoiled food in the refrigerator, and others occasionally noticed how extreme it became. Parker connected with people who understood showmanship and hustling the way he did, and during his Eddie Arnold days, he became friends with Connie B. Gay. Gay was a country DJ and promoter from the Washington, D.C. area who had a Depression-era background as a street salesman and was very blunt. He once described Hank Williams as a goner, just a pile of shit mixed with alcohol and pills. Like Parker, he knew how to grab attention, work a crowd, and turn spectacle into business. During the Depression, he was able to gather a crowd by holding up a Gila monster and shouting, "I'm gonna eat this thing." Nash writes, quote, when the Colonel first acquired Elvis, it was natural that he continue the association with his old friend. He allowed Gay to book Presley on one of his country music cruises down the Potomac in March 1956. But it was the only time I didn't fill the boat, Gay recalled. There was an engine problem and we couldn't take off. A lot of people wanted their money back, so I paid them and they missed Elvis, end quote. Parker's friendship with Gay went beyond business. Their families were so close that Tom and Marie stayed with Connie and his wife Hazel whenever they were near Washington, D.C., and Gay's children, Judy and Jan, were even told they would go live with the Parkers if anything happened to their parents. During one of the Parkers' visits to their house, Judy, who was an Elvis fan and honorary National Fan Club president, noticed Marie scraping out the very last bit of lipstick in the tube, and it gave her the impression that Parker did not let Marie replace things until they were completely used up. Judy recalls, later, Mother said, "Well, if you knew Tom, you'd know why." Judy and Jan remember their mother catered to the Parkers, making the foods Tom loved, and even timed the banana pudding to be done around the time the Parkers arrived so it would still be warm. Parker, who the teenagers remembered as an old, fat, nice guy, always scheming with Daddy on how to make a buck with the hillbilly trade, would eat bowls and bowls of it. Jan remembers, one reason Tom always stayed with us was so he could save a hotel bill. This one time, we'd put him up for days, and as he started to leave, he said, Hazel, I'd like to give you a little something for your hospitality. And he handed her a bag of all the little hotel soaps he'd collected on his most recent swing. That was her present. Everybody liked Tom, but he was a moocher par excellence. Parker's thriftiness was partly real and partly part of his act, another piece of the snowman persona. But underneath it, Marie knew there was fear. After his heart problems, Parker worried he might die suddenly and leave her financially unprotected. Parker did have another heart attack in 1956, though it was mild. Bitsy Mott claimed it may have been triggered by an argument with Elvis over Elvis becoming more difficult and not wanting to show up on time. Parker was not seriously disabled by it, but he had to stay confined to his Texas hotel room for several days. Nash writes, quote, in the future, Parker would use his heart condition as a form of manipulation, taking to his bed until Elvis capitulated and fell into line. Nonetheless, the underlying disease was real, and he unsuccessfully tried to sell Elvis's contract to both Oscar Davis and Connie B. Gay. End quote. Parker's heart attacks affected him emotionally as well as physically. They brought on depression and stirred up old anxieties, especially his intense fear of death. Parker's fear of death may have been tied to his Catholic upbringing and guilt and whatever haunted him from the past in Holland. As he became wealthy, he began donating large sums to charity, possibly out of genuine generosity, or tax strategy, fear of judgment, or some mixture of all three. By the late 1960s, he was contributing to as many as 31 organizations. But as Byron Raphael remembers, he was never free and easy when it came to giving away money to his employees, like a bonus at Christmas. Nash writes, quote, and strangers who wrote into the office with a hard luck story and a plea for help received only a terse, I am so sorry, and a picture of Elvis. But although he preferred to do things to help people that didn't cost him financially, cajoling RCA's corporate office into donating appliances and television sets to philanthropic organizations and hospitals in his name, for example, at times he dug deep into his own pocket, especially where children, unwed mothers, or crusty old carnies were concerned, end quote. Parker helped the King's Daughters Day Home, which catered to low-income families, by buying a washer and dryer and later funding a new kitchen. But it also helped Marie socially because she was trying to leave behind her carnival past and present herself as a respectable, cultured woman involved in local civic and garden club circles. Parker's charity was complicated. He sometimes shared credit with Elvis or kept donations quiet, but he also expected goodwill, favors, or protection in return. Nash writes, quote, he declared near the end of his life that through the years he donated more than $500,000 to charities, 2/3 of it to organizations in Tennessee where high-powered lawyers and a succession of governors, including Frank G. Clement, who made Parker an honorary colonel in 1953, and Lieutenant Governor Frank Gorell, picked small, deserving groups such as the Nashville Youth Orchestra and dispersed the monies for him. Such connections, of course, could be invaluable for a man who'd entered the country illegally and feared both discovery and deportation, end quote. Parker's charitable giving also extended into local church connections. Through Mary and Patty Diskin, who belonged to St. Joseph's Catholic Church near Parker's home on Gallatin Road, Parker was approached about helping pay for air conditioning in the church school auditorium. Parker later exaggerated the size of his donation to St. Joseph's, claiming he had paid for the entire air conditioning system. But Father Rowling remembered it differently. The church only owed about $2,000, and Parker covered that balance. He continued giving smaller Christmas checks and even donated a miniature pony for a fundraiser. Parker also gave Father Rowling a small truckload of Elvis memorabilia, but the priest destroyed it because he believed Elvis's image and performances might be morally dangerous or evil. Years later, Rowling regretted burning it and called it a sad mistake. Parker kept a distance from organized religion, even though he had Catholic roots back in Holland. He might attend social events connected to the church, but he did not go to Mass, and he did not join Marie at her Baptist church either. He may have feared religion's deeper questions, death, judgment, punishment, and guilt, especially given the secrets and anxieties from his past. Nash says Parker's connection to Father Rowling faded as Parker became more involved with Elvis's Hollywood career in 1956 and spent more time in California. They crossed paths again after Marie died in 1986 when Parker brought her back to Madison to be entombed at Spring Hill Cemetery. There he bought only one crypt, which suggests Parker's fear of death. He could plan for Marie, but he avoided thinking about his own burial or future. Nash writes, quote, Madison was where Marie had become a lady, an accepted member of a sometimes snooty community. But now he was worried about her soul and perhaps his own. Would Monsieur Rowling perform the funeral along with the Baptist minister? End quote. Rowling found it strange because Marie had not attended St. Joseph's, he didn't remember ever meeting her, and Parker had never discussed religion or even admitted to being Catholic in all the years they had known each other. Nash writes, quote, but Father Rowling had already figured it out. One day when he was next door visiting the Diskins, he noticed something interesting. The colonel, who never forgot who he was or where he came from, sending money to Holland for the flood relief in 1953, kept what the priest surmised was pictures of family members on his wall. The one that struck the father most was that of a nun, Parker's older sister, Marie. End quote. That's it for chapter 10. Stay tuned for chapter 11, which is titled Elvis Makes Pitches. See you then.